extremist Islam, Islamists, the Israel-Palestinian issue, Jews, anti-Semitism, and the far left, and Marxism and communism. It's all been kind of slammed together. And I think that often some quite unusual bedfellows have found themselves fighting on the same side, just not, as anyone from any society that has lost freedoms will tell you. So whether it was my father at the time that he lost them, or whether it's friends of mine now who are Iranian dissidents living outside Iran because of the Islamic Republic tyrannical rule there, all of these people will say, you know, we had something and we lost it. Even if you only see the symptoms in terms of anti-Israel or anti-Jewish actions, it's important for everybody to understand that this is a much bigger fight and that they need to get involved right now.
It's a real privilege to have with us today Jonathan Sacerdoti, who is a British journalist, someone who defended Israel at last year's Oxford University debates. He writes for the Daily Express and the Spectator, and he's a defender of Israel, the West, and he speaks out against anti-Semitism. Welcome to the Viktor Frankl podcast.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
As we all know, there's been a tremendous campaign to delegitimize Israel, to claim that Israel is committing a genocide. But it seems odd because Hamas and their Arab friends seem to be committing the genocide against the Jews. It's like, we don't have the right to exist, because we know it's not because of the Holocaust we have the right to exist. Jews have been in Israel for thousands of years. It's always been the Jewish homeland.
So the idea that it is some sort of reparation for the Holocaust is itself incorrect as a starting point. And I think that idea has allowed Arabs in the region, but also others who are against Jews or against Israel, the opportunity to say, why should Arabs in the region suffer because of the wrongs wrought upon the Jews by Europeans? And I think that's a wholly wrong and misguided way to explain the rebirth of the state of Israel. Israel was always the homeland of the Jewish people. And even Jews who don't know it ought to just look in the prayer book, because it's fundamental to so much of Jewish prayer and Jewish culture and Jewish tradition. Jews pray every day, those who do, facing Jerusalem. The religion itself is full of references to Zion and Jerusalem, and that all predates the Holocaust. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, we've been in the land of Israel for thousands of years. There were two temples, each lasting over 400 years. There was King David, there was King Solomon, and the Bible, one of the oldest documents in the world, talks about how God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. So when people are saying that we don't have rights to the land and should be removed, it sounds to me that that is a claim for ethnic cleansing or genocide against the Jews. What do you think about that?
So, you know, again, I'll just say it's not just the Bible, because some people will poo-poo that. It's also archaeology and just basic facts. The historical facts show Jewish existence and life there, you know, dating back that far as well. There is a lot of talk, for example, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of things like that at the moment. And it's usually, they're usually allegations leveled at Israel by some people. I will say that I believe that actually October the 7th was almost like a textbook example of an attempt at genocide by the Palestinian terrorists who invaded. They came over the border, they slaughtered and kidnapped and raped almost indiscriminately, but of course it wasn't indiscriminate. They were going for anyone Israeli, anyone in Israel. And it also had other features of genocide, including that ordinary people, let's say, from Gaza joined in. They weren't just militants or terrorists. Once the fence was down, there was a certain number of just regular Gazan people who also invaded, and you could see the difference in the videos. Some of them had sandals or flip-flops on. They weren't in the military clothes that the Nukba forces were in. So I think we saw there another feature of genocide that genocide scholars point to, which is where a society is so indoctrinated as to hate all of the people that it's targeting, their actual neighbors in a sense. And the idea that there is no right for Israel to exist, I mean, it's absolutely preposterous that anyone who considers themselves a serious mainstream politician in this day and age is having that conversation anymore. If only because even if he, for some reason, thinks there is a historical wrong in the foundation of the state of Israel, the modern state. I mean, so what? We're a long way on from there. The state exists. It exists completely according to international law. It was voted into existence acceptably at that point. In fact, the people that rejected it were the Arabs, who refused the prospect of having their own state alongside it, and they've refused it again and again and again since then at every single realistic opportunity that they've been given to have one. So I think people like that are probably ignorant of the fact, but also, as you say, dangerous, because they choose to try to misrepresent what happened. They choose to try to misrepresent what's going on now. And they do it in a way that is very detrimental to not just people in Israel and people in the Middle East, including Arabs and Palestinians. This just helps to spread hatred about Jews. It helps to spread that, sadly, too common prejudice against us today, which is that the Jews of Israel, at the very least, or the state of Israel, the Jewish state, is this baby-murdering, vengeful, bloodthirsty, evil society that is trying to carry out all these wrongs indiscriminately and purely for the sake of revenge, or through some sort of primal biblical hatred.
Very much so. I mean, when you talk about the baby-killing, murderous society, that's exactly what Hamas is. And they actually say that in their charter. Let's take a look at their charter. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Only the Garkid tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews. So what do you think about the Hamas charter and what they're saying?
Well, the Hamas Charter is obviously genocidal in intent, as is Hamas itself. It was founded as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was banned from Egypt, and then there was fertile ground for it in the Gaza Strip, and that is how it was born. It is very clear in that charter, but also in all of Hamas's behavior ever since then, in the 80s, that their aim is not to try and negotiate some form of peaceful coexistence or Palestinian statehood alongside Israel. If you read the rest of the charter, it's very clear on that as well. No peaceful solutions, no negotiations, nothing. None of that is part of the agenda of Hamas. But again, I think over the last couple of years, since October the 7th, just under 2 years, there's been a lot of public discussion about Hamas and its genocidal intent, its absolutism in terms of what it wants, in wanting an extremist Islamic Palestinian state instead of a state of Israel, a Jewish state of Israel. But I think that because we've discussed that a lot, we've also neglected somewhat to discuss the rest of Palestinian politics and society. And I think it's worth mentioning that even the apparently moderate side of Palestinian mainstream politics is not really that much better, even if it isn't necessarily framed constantly in religious Islamic terms in the way that Hamas might. The Fatah party, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, any kind of reference point we might make, they are all also absolutist, extremist, rejectionist. They have no intention from any of their actions or stated policies of accepting a Jewish state living alongside a Palestinian state. The very closest they've ever got in negotiations was to create a Palestinian state alongside a state of Israel that would then have to absorb millions of so-called Palestinian refugees, which would render it not a Jewish state. So even if they have at times in mainstream Palestinian discourse accepted the possibility of two states, it would effectively be two Arab states. There would be no Jewish state left, and that in itself is preposterous. But since October the 7th, I think we've had these conversations much more frankly, and that's partly what I think has riled the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish people around the world so much, is that this atrocity carried out on Jewish people actually laid bare the lie of the two-state delusion. It showed that there was no possibility for two states, something that people like me were not meant to say in discussions and debates, because it showed a lack, that people would say, a lack of concern on our part for the Palestinian Arabs, or it showed a lack of willing to accept something that would be a compromise. And of course, I do have sympathy for people who are caught up in this and are suffering if they're innocent and if they are not committed to terrorism and violence against Jews. And I do believe in compromise, and I do believe that, you know, any solution will come about through some form of compromise. But I'm not a fantasist. I've never believed that it will come about by creating two states which have to both absorb infinite numbers of Palestinians and only one of them is allowed to have any Jews in it. That is, you know, to create a Palestinian state that is Judenrein, no Jews, Jew-free. That is ethnic cleansing. That says that when we come to a final status agreement, Jews will be kicked out of part of the territory. Those are the sorts of things nobody will bear to hear the other way around. But when you say them about Jews being kicked out, it's sort of seen as acceptable. So I think that all these terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing and two-state solutions, they all need to be reassessed for what they actually mean.
Yeah, they mean the destruction of the Jews because they don't really want to compromise. Let's take a look at your debate at Oxford University late last year.
Hamas, on the other hand, does hide its weapons, its control centers in schools, in mosques, in universities, in hospitals.
Order. The speaker will be heard in silence.
Israel has provided 700,000 tons of food to Gaza during this war. That is a daily average. That is a daily average of 3,200 calories per person. The NHS in this country.
Order. The speaker is entitled to be heard in silence and to be.
No, they're cursing. That's different. They're cursing. That's different.
Yes.
They need to get out.
If she doesn't get out, if she doesn't get out, all of us go out.
Please have the seat.
Jonathan, do you think any of your opponents of that debate wanted to hear what you had to say?
No. But I will say something, watching it back. I haven't watched that for a while. And a few things actually occurred to me while I was watching it just now. One of them is encouraging for the idea of coexistence. And that is, I don't know if you noticed, but the two people who most vociferously stood up in my defense as I was being quite horribly abused by that audience. And you can only really get half of it because most of it wasn't mic'd up. The two people who stood up to insist that I should be heard fairly were actually two Arabs, Yosef Haddad and Mossab Hassan Youssef. And they are two people who should give us enormous encouragement. That, of course, this isn't about whether or not Jews can live alongside non-Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, whatever. It's about attitudes of who the people involved are. So Mossab was debating alongside me. He is, as you all know, he was the son of an important figure in Hamas who defected and then worked as a double agent, informing the Israeli security services on suicide bombings for around 10 years and saved hundreds or thousands of lives through those actions. And he's since October the 7th become an enormous advocate for Israel across the internet and on TV and across the media worldwide. And the other person who stood up in my defense there was Yosef Haddad, also speaking alongside me in the team. And he is an Israeli Arab, a Christian, who also travels the world explaining to people what it's actually like living as a non-Jewish Arab in the state of Israel and all the opportunities that it has offered him and afforded him and all of the things he has done for the state. So that it is encouraging. However, that's not what the 13 million plus people who've watched that video, I think, were watching for. They've watched because that was a perfect example of how that audience did not want to hear what I had to say. That audience did not want to hear a word of it. And the very thing that triggered them, actually, I don't know if you noticed, it's not just hearing different opinions and analysis. The things that actually really wound them up were just facts.
The truth.
I gave an assessment of facts. The number of calories worked out as an average that had been taken in daily to the Gaza Strip during the war at that point was what I declared it to be, and that was higher than the recommended calorie intake of an adult male in the United Kingdom by the National Health Service here. That didn't mean that every single person in Gaza was getting access to that food or that aid. I never said it did. But the point was simply that they couldn't bear facts. They didn't want to hear anything. And when they couldn't argue with a fact or an argument, what they resorted to was screaming. It was a sort of rhetorical equivalent of terrorism. It was just to kind of blow up the debate rather than to allow me to speak. And I think that is very symbolic of the problem that we encounter today, not just on this topic, on a whole range of topics. And I think that Israel and Jews have become one of the many sticks with which that kind of person tries to beat the West and undermine our Western values. So I think it's really important that actually people who watched that video understood this was not just about Israel or Jews.
Yeah, on the one hand, you have your Mossabs and your Haddads. On the other side, you see these people screaming at you, almost violently attacking you. I think this is something which is happening in campuses and happening in America as well. What do you think about that?
What's been going on in the US, on campuses and elsewhere, has been nothing short of greatly alarming for Jewish people and non-Jewish people who care about freedom and fairness and living our lives in a tolerant way of one another. I don't think there seems to me, anyway, to be any intention of living and let live. You know, there's no sense of living alongside one another with difference. And I accept that this is a topic, you know, Israel, especially at this time of war, is a topic of great emotional tension for some people, predominantly because I think many of them have been fed a vast number of lies about Israel and Jews. But regardless, I can understand that some people feel differently from others, obviously. I just don't see how anyone benefits from that kind of behavior, from the divisive behavior of violent speech or violence or disruption. And I just think it's terrifying to me. It's a good example of how extremist Islamists, the Israel-Palestinian issue, Jews, anti-Semitism, and the far left, and Marxism and communism, it's all been kind of slammed together. And I think that often some quite unusual bedfellows have found themselves fighting on the same side against Western values and Israel and Judaism and Jewish values and Christian values even, because they have a common aim, which is to undermine the West, to undermine Western values, to undermine the way that we do things proudly, especially in somewhere like New York and the US, the sort of capitalist, proud, free society that people like me are enormously grateful to be part of, are very proud of. We think are built on a foundation of greatness, of fairness, of ethics and morality. But all of those groups, even if they don't seem like they have common cause, do have a common aim to undermine all of that. And I think that's why they've often found themselves fighting alongside us. And they are a formidable enemy in that regard, because it's very pervasive. I think it's very attractive to a young audience. I think it's very enchanting, very romantic almost. And I think that is part of our failure, is that we haven't managed to necessarily represent the alternative, what is good about what we hold dear and we think is important. I'm not blaming anyone. I just think it's looking at it. It seems to me that all the things you and I know are great about our society somehow.
About freedom in the West, you mean?
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, but again, I think just to say on that one, I think that freedoms are really easy to take for granted. And I come from a generation, despite knowing my father's story, I'm lucky to have grown up in that post-war period where I don't think I ever really had any serious threats to my freedom here in the United Kingdom for most of my life. And I think the risk at that point is that you assume it's a default and you assume it's a battle that's been won conclusively and permanently. And it's just not, as anyone from any society that has lost freedoms will tell you. So whether it was my father at the time that he lost them, or whether it's friends of mine now who are Iranian dissidents living outside Iran because of the Islamic Republic tyrannical rule there, all of these people will say, you know, we had something and we lost it. And that's why, looking at where we are now here in the UK, or where the US is in some respects, don't take it for granted. Freedom isn't free. Sometimes it comes at great cost, and we all of us, if we enjoy our freedoms, have a responsibility to fight for them in whatever way we need to.
100%. And I think the threat that Americans didn't understand is real. And you've seen this in England very clearly, is that red-green alliance, which has just exploded, the far left alliance with Islamization and the extremists. And it's exploded on the streets of London. We've seen this in the streets of New York. We've seen it at Columbia and Harvard and Stanford, all these wonderful places that were the icons of American civilization, the bastions of freedom in the West. But we see now that the left on campuses and on the streets of England and New York are uniting with Islam. And I find it quite odd that people that are homosexual who are supporting Hamas at the same time, if they would be living in Gaza, for example, they'd be thrown off the roofs. Let's take a look at a video. Yeah, go ahead. What are you going to say, please?
I was just going to say, I agree. It's so weird because, it's been stated many, many times, but it's just the people who are seeing themselves as humanitarians, as liberals, or people who are protectors of freedoms and women's rights and gay rights are in their translation of that into seeing everything as the oppressed and the oppressor. They are picking a group that they've decided is oppressed and championing them against the supposed oppressor, all the time not seeing that Israel is a country which probably has the highest level of educational outcomes for Arab Muslims in the Middle East,
and the most freedom for Muslims and Christians and homosexuals in the world.
Exactly, for female Arabs, for female Muslims, for gay people, for Jews, for Christians, for any faith. Israel it's a country that absolutely protects those rights, and it's not perfect. Of course, it will have elements of strife and racism, as any free country will in relation to minority groups. And so all nations do try to iron that out where they can. But the side that they're picking in that fight is one that famously kills homosexuals simply for being gay, famously subjugates women, famously is not free politically, famously doesn't have free press or free judiciary. It has none of the things that they are meant to champion and hold dear in their belief system, and yet they're still more than ready. They're passionate, they're fierce about which side they're taking, and that's why I think so many times people always say criticism of Israel isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. Well, no, it's not necessarily anti-Semitic, but when we're looking at why some groups seem so ready to look at it in the way I just described, it is very difficult sometimes to not to wonder if maybe the Jewishness of one side of this does have something to do with it.
Let's take a look at their demonstrations.
Queer rights, trans rights. We say no to genocide. These are Queers for Palestine protesters. We've seen a lot of this in recent weeks. The great irony, that display might get those people killed in the Gaza Strip. What appears to be lost on these protesters is that gay and transgender people in Palestinian territories face an extraordinary level of persecution. In Gaza, homosexuality can be punished with years in prison. You also might be executed, including by members of your own family. A few years ago, Hamas, the terrorist organization that controls Gaza, tortured and killed one of its own members for allegedly having sex with another man. Not long ago in the West Bank, a young man's severed head was found on the side of the road after he was killed allegedly for the crime of being gay. So where do many of these persecuted people try to get asylum? In Israel, the same country these stateside protesters are speaking out against. The Israel-Palestine conflict is complicated. This aspect of it, not so much, because Queers for Palestine is about as convincing as minks for fur coats.
I don't know where to start. I mean, it should be funny, but it's not. It's funny and terrible. I mean, there was a protest here in the UK. I remember watching it. I can't remember quite what their chant was. Outside Parliament, it was something along the lines of, trans rights and Palestine. It's one cause. I mean, they had something catchier than that. I won't get any prizes for writing chants for protests, but it's so absurd. It's just so completely insane that you either have to just say, well, these people are incredibly stupid, or you have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not incredibly stupid, and then it's something actually probably far worse. They're deeply horrible evil people even for trying to. I just can't. I can't even find words for it. And I'll tell you this: that what again, I do think what these causes maybe have in common, and perhaps this is slightly controversial of me in today's day and age to say something that was always fact and known for the vast majority of human existence. But the trans lobby has some things in common with the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish and pro-Palestinianism lobby, which is that, again, it's an attempt to undermine the way we've always done things based on the ethics we've always had and the Judeo-Christian values that are a bedrock of our society. And I say this as a gay person, that the push towards self-identification of one's gender, towards eroding the very binary fact that has existed since the first humans of man and woman, the very clearest, most obvious, most unnecessary to state binary of male and female that every human knows instinctively from birth. The attempt to undermine that is part of a wider attempt to undermine the way we do things in our society, as is the attack on Israel and Jews. And that is what these things actually have in common. So it's not necessarily surprising to see these causes joining up, because again, I keep trying to emphasize this to non-Jewish people. Jews may be the first victims via Israel often, but it's not really about Jews. It's about undermining something that we represent, or something that we are part of the history of, or the bedrock of, or that we're the first rung in a ladder. It's about undermining something far, far worse, and about this march through the institutions to try and change museums and schools and academia and the police and the judiciary and parliament and politics. It is an attempt to undermine the very bedrock of who we are. And that's why I think, even if you only see the symptoms in terms of anti-Israel or anti-Jewish actions, it's important for everybody to understand that this is a much bigger fight and that they need to get involved right now.
This is why it's so troubling hearing these words, these epithets like the Jews are committing genocide, or they also want to globalize the Intifada. I mean, that's very frightening, to globalize this amount of hatred and death.
It's troubling to me, this phrase, globalize the Intifada, because on one hand, I think that Intifada has been global for quite some time, in the sense that one of the most noticeable contributions of the Palestinian movement to humanity has been their development of suicide bombing as a strategy for political influence. They didn't invent it, but they certainly made it their own.
Popularized it.
Yeah, exactly. And honed it and refined it. And I would say that the Intifada, to most people who knew that word before 2 years ago, referred to the first and second Intifadas, which involved the deliberate targeting of civilians in terrorist attacks, that things like the Dolphinarium bombing in 2001, 21 teenagers murdered at that, pizzeria bombings like in Jerusalem at the Sparrow Pizzeria, again, families, mothers, children, ordinary civilians targeted and killed. But then we've seen that repeated around Europe, around the US. I mean, I've stood as a journalist outside the sites of similar terror attacks inspired by Islamic extremism. So very similar in many respects, from the 7/7 tube bombings here in the UK, which were Islamist jihadist bombings. We just marked the 20th anniversary the other day, to the Bataclan bombings, the hyper-caché Jewish kosher supermarket in Paris attack, the London Bridge attacks, the Manchester Arena bombing here at an Ariana Grande concert. The list's sadly very long. And as I said before, it's not just Jews they're targeting. If one is, for some reason, sympathetic about the first and second Intifadas because they targeted Jews and Israelis, well, one ought to think very carefully about globalizing that intifada, because what it looks like is everybody else being blown up as well. And the point I'm constantly trying to make is that this isn't just about Jews. It's very importantly is about Jews in some respect for those of us who are Jewish, but it's about so much more than that. And this idea of globalizing the intifada, I think, again, you have to have something wrong in your head to think that that is a smart phrase, to try even to define it as something different. Why would you try to, why wouldn't you just use a different phrase? Why wouldn't you just find a way that made it completely clear you're not talking about mass casualty terrorism aimed at civilians, which is what most of us think about when we hear the word intifada? Think of another way to phrase it. The only reason you could be so wedded to that phrase is that that is what you mean. And if that's what you mean, you're somebody I think we should be very worried about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And finally, I want to know where you get your strength from, taking a leadership role in fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting for Zionism, and fighting for Israel. Did you have certain experiences that made you who you are today, that brought you to that desire to represent to the Jewish people so brilliantly?
Well, I'm flattered and honored that you would say those things apply to me. I consider myself just someone that's interested in the truth. And I'm certainly someone that's not afraid of holding a view, a minority view or a dissenting view. I think that's been part of my upbringing, that I was educated to believe in looking for evidence and trying to interrogate ideas to see if they're sound. And I try to apply that mostly to my own ideas, actually. So I know that we are, as a species, inclined to confirmation bias and to tribalism and all of those things. And I'm sure that I am at times guilty of those things as any other human being. But because I'm aware of that, I do try to interrogate my own views. I do try to interrogate popularly held views, especially as things tend to try to present themselves as a consensus opinion when I don't think that they are. And so, yes, I suppose that has made me always keen to just try and find out what I actually think based on what I can actually find out. I also think it's really important to say that I'm willing to be proven wrong as well, which I think has fallen out of fashion enormously today. So part of standing up for what you consider to be right and true, I think, has to be the willingness to listen to other people and their arguments, and then evaluate them and yours according to what you consider to be a sort of rules of logic and reasonableness and truth. And then, yes, if you've got something wrong or you want to modify your position on something, it shouldn't be the worst thing in the world to do that. So I do think that that's an important part of how I try to approach things. But generally speaking, I just try to be a clear voice of analysis, and I try to explain things as I see them, as they are. And yes, I keep being told that is bravery. I don't really personally consider it to be some form of bravery or leadership. I just consider it to be kind of obvious that that's what we should all be doing in our own lives and in our own circles. I'm privileged to have a platform and a voice, for whatever reason, to be able to write these things for wider audiences and to be able to do podcasts and have conversations like this that others will watch and hope that it helps them to make their minds up. But I think that everybody in their own existence, in their own circles, in their own families, their own places of work, their own schools, colleges, they have people they can engage in conversations with and people they can influence or they can be influenced by. So I sort of feel like everyone has the opportunity to do what I do or what you do in some circle of influence. And if we're all able to say what we think and what we believe and to consider other people's positions and to discuss things, that's basically the ideal for me. I don't want everyone to agree on everything. I just want us to be able to have the conversations and to try to see things calmly and clearly, and then that hopefully will help us to kind of dial down some of the anger that some of the people we've discussed today seem to express, and more than express, seem to trade on and encourage and provoke, because all of those things can be politically helpful, especially during elections, but I think they're really damaging to us as humans, and they're damaging to our relationships with each other. When in reality, there's so much that we all ought to be able to agree on, and I think that it's important in my work for me to try always to just be calm and reasoned and put things across in that way, and then hope for the best.
That was the brilliance I saw at that debate at Oxford University. You stood up and stayed actually very calm when everybody was screaming and perhaps trying to kill you. So thank you for joining the podcast today. We look forward to having you again in the future.
It's been really great. Thanks for the conversation.